watching MotoringBox, proudly supported by Century Batteries.
Hey guys, welcome back to MotoringBox. I'm Sean McKellar, and you haven't seen me for a while. But we are back with the AU Fairmont Ghia Turbo project. You might remember last time we actually installed a Haltech 750 Elite into this thing, and we were right on the verge of firing it up, but we had to finish off a few little things. In the meantime, I actually went overseas for a couple of weeks. That's why you haven't seen me. But we're back, and I'm going to bring you up to speed as to what's been happening with this car. So, the Haltech is installed. Everything is looking awesome. The only outstanding items I had left at the time was actually the wideband O2 sensor install, which has now been done. I'll show you that in a second. And I also had to plumb up the radiator, fill up the coolant again, which has also been done too. So, I can happily tell you this car runs. On the Haltech, I've got it running. But it hasn't been without its problems. But before we talk about those problems, let me show you what I've done in here. So since you last saw this thing, I've done two things. I've actually installed a wideband O2 sensor. You can see it down there on the exhaust. So this came as part of that wideband box kit. So it came with the sensor, it came with the wiring, which is, you can see here, it's tucked in behind the brake lines that run all the way over to the passenger side. And then they disappear through this grommet into the cabin to the WB1 box. And also I needed to run a vacuum line so that the Haltech knows what the manifold pressure is. The Haltech, you could use the manifold pressure sensor, but the Elite 750 has its own onboard pressure sensor. So you need a vacuum line. So I've thrown in a T-piece here, the one that goes to the fuel pressure regulator, T-pieced it. Vacuum line runs through that grommet as well. So this is behind the washer bottle, so that'll all be hidden once that bottle gets reinstalled. So just to recap what we've got here, we've got a Haltech Elite 750, which is spliced into the stock standard AU Falcon ECU's wiring loom as per this spreadsheet. This again is linked in the video description below. We have a triple channel igniter, so we can utilize the stock standard AU Falcon coil pack block with the wasted spark coil system. Do check the previous video if you want more information on that. And also a WB1 wideband controller, which the wideband is plugged into. You can see it coming out here. It goes through the grommet in the back of the dash there. So yeah, that's how it's all set up. So when we ended off here in the previous video, you might remember I mentioned there was a Smart Shield hand icon on the dash. When I attempted to start the car the very first time after that video, it didn't actually do anything. It just kind of clicked and there was nothing. I loaded up ForceScan. I couldn't do anything on ForceScan. It just resulted in errors. Turns out there's a little connector under the dash, which I unplugged when I was pulling the ECU out and doing all the wiring and everything. I forgot to plug it back in. I think it was partially seated because there were some weird things happening with the dash, but once I clipped that in, Smart Shield went away, the car cranked. So that was the first problem I sorted out. The next problem was a little bit more problematic. I was getting a crankshaft sync error and also a home position sensor error. So if we look at the crank signal error first, I think that one was actually due to the engine having too much fuel. The injectors were putting too much fuel into it. I actually had a same problem with the BA Falcon when I had the Haltech put into that back in the day. So that was okay, but the home position error was actually because the loom, the patch loom that Bill Hooton made for me didn't actually have home position wiring. So the home position is actually the cam position sensor. So there was none of that, no wiring for that on that loom, and I think you don't actually need it. And to deep dive that for a second, right? This engine runs 6 cylinders, it's a straight 6, and it runs a wasted spark setup for the spark plugs. Because at any given time in a straight 6, there are 2 pistons coming up to top dead center, whether it's the outer 2, the sort of middle 2, or the 2 in the center. And for every 2 pistons that come up to the top dead center, one of them has got a fuel and air charge in there and it needs a spark. The other one is just pushing out exhaust gas from a previous combustion cycle. It's a 4-stroke engine. There's suck, squeeze, bang, blow. So one of them is going bang and one of them is going blow. The ECU doesn't know which one unless it has a cam position sensor. Because it's a 4-stroke engine, the crank needs to rotate twice to complete the combustion cycle on every cylinder pretty much. So I believe to get your engine running without a home signal, you need to set up your injectors to be batch fired. And what that means, it's kind of like a wasted spark system, but for injectors. For both of those cylinders, it would actually fire fuel into the intake runners of both of those cylinders. And then whichever one has the valves open, will get fuel. And then whichever one doesn't have valves open, it already has fuel, it'll fire, it'll run. So now after all that, I could be talking shit, but I couldn't get it to run, right? So I actually installed wires for the home positive and home negative signal. So I now know the position of the camshaft. I now know the position of the crankshaft. I was able to set it to sequential, which means the ECU knows which port needs fuel when. It can just fire those injectors whenever it needs it, instead of firing two and sort of, praying for the best. Now, the last time I started this thing up, the idle was still a little bit rough. So while I start it again this time, I'm going to try fine tune it a little bit further. I'm going to go back to the base output here for the idle. You can see here with this little circle, this is the cell we're currently in. Let's see how she goes. Okay. You can see here as well, we're actually getting these engine position and trigger sync errors. That's kind of when the fuel mixture isn't right. You do sometimes receive errors like that. Not terribly worried about it. All right, it's now idling by itself. Not too badly, actually. I might leave this setting alone. There is also lots of tables in this ECU to do with when does it need to throw extra fuel in, like on a cold start. I think there's actually a cold start table where you can select, how much more fuel goes in the first couple of seconds of the engine running, the first 10 seconds, the first 20, and kind of slowly ramp it out. So I probably need to look at that, but listen to it. It's actually idling really well. If I give it a bit of throttle, it actually sounds really happy. Super smooth, actually. So now that it is idling, we also have this idle long-term trim, which it is actually fixing my settings for me by the look of it. So it's kind of probably going a bit too fast. I've got the gain turned up hugely, so if I just turn that down a bit, it's 0 minimum, 3000 maximum. The higher the number, the faster it trims, but it can kind of oscillate a little bit. This is quite a high setting. I might turn that down a bit. Yeah, see, it's actually reducing it now, but it's reducing it a lot slower than what it was doing before. So through this, it can kind of fine tune the idle by itself. Just by sniffing that O2 sensor in the exhaust, is it idling lean or idling rich? And it can kind of, add fuel or remove fuel. So it's added a lot of fuel here into the 20 and 40 degree cell. Now that we're into 60, it hasn't done anything yet. It must be pretty happy so far, but it'll change that if it needs to. And the same thing happens as well when you're actually driving later. You've got this long-term fuel trim. It's actually done a little bit. It must have been when I revved it. Let's rev it up. We'll go a little bit higher. Not doing anything at the moment, but again, it'll add or remove fuel. So it's actually removed, up to 3% fuel here, which is kind of a good thing, because that must mean that my fuel map at the moment is a little bit rich, which is nice and safe. If it was adding fuel, then obviously, this base, fuel tuning, this base map here would be obviously a bit low if it was adding fuel, and you wouldn't want that, because an engine running lean is a little bit dangerous. So the fact that it's taking fuel out, I think, is good. Again, everything on the dash works except for the temperature gauge. It's still saying cold at the moment, but you can see here I'm getting a reading in NSP of 68 degrees. That's probably about right. I'm not 100% sure if the sensor is set up correctly, but look, it runs. The only thing left for me now, right, is whether the gearbox works properly. I've put it into reverse and drive, and it shunts around, it does that properly. But I have a rather steep driveway, and I need to know, is it actually going through the gears properly? It should, because to because for the gearbox logic to work correctly, I assume it would need RPM, it would need throttle position to know whether to kick down or not. It probably needs temperature, engine temperature, and a few other things, but it should still have all of the things it needs. So I need to work out, is it going through the gears properly before I back it out of here? Because if it's locked in third, like limp mode or something, it might be hard to get back up the driveway again after I drive it. So what I'm going to do after this, we'll put it on jack stands, just so we can put it in drive and just kind of see, is the gearbox behaving? You could plug ForScan into the AU ECU, but it's probably got 1,000 error codes because it hasn't got a whole lot of sensor information anymore. But look, the Haltech runs everything from here. It just needs to do the gearbox, so hopefully it's happy enough to do that. The only other thing I need to probably have a play around with is this map prediction fuel film, and that's to do with when you stab the throttle, the ECU needs to sort of fire in instantly a certain amount more fuel so it doesn't lean out for a second. If that's not set properly, it can kind of stumble a little bit like that. To a degree, this does tune itself too, but there's a few figures in here which you can sort of play around with to do with fine tuning that. I've actually had quite a bit of success with the BA Falcon, tuning that aspect of it, so with time I'll get that smoothed out too. So, we're almost up to the temp where the fans are going to kick in, and I expect them to, because they're all wired in properly too. You've got outputs here, so you've got fan 1 out, fan 2, they'll start flashing once they're actually running. I might turn the aircon on as well because it's very hot. I still have to tune the settings for that because it has to bump the RPM up a little bit to compensate for the load of the aircon compressor. But it's pretty smooth at the moment. There goes one of the fans. So the Haltech knows when the aircon compressor engages. It can bump the revs, it can put the fan on as well. The aircon is working. Let me shut the windows. So that is nice. It is idling a bit high, it's about 1,000, but again, we can configure that. Let's have a look and see what our idle trim is doing. Yeah, look, it's sort of added some figures. It's added some fuel there pretty much all through the range in different varying amounts. Over time, it'll keep doing it. You can turn the gain down a little bit too, probably back to like 50 or something, just so it slows down. If it's set too high, it can oscillate a little bit. It can add fuel and then be like, oh, I've added too much, take some out. You need to sort of slow it down a bit so it can learn more slowly over time. Just check out our fuel trim as well. They're pretty stable, they haven't done much. So long as the gearbox works, which we'll check now, we can pretty much take this thing for a drive. Stoked. Car is idling high, but it is what it is. Sort that out later. Let's put it into drive. Handbrake off. It appears to be okay. So we should be able to take this thing out for a drive and yeah, just see how she goes. Let's do it. All right, we are ready for a drive. A few days have passed, the car's cold. Let's go for another cold start. Straight up, look at that. For the first part of the drive, I'm gonna let you guys look at the dash and the laptop. I don't want to dox myself, show you where I live. But this is the first drive. Okay, she stumbled a little bit when we put her into gear just because the revs drop a little bit. So we may have to look at that as a setting. But so far, it seems to be shifting through the gears. We're coasting down a hill here at the moment, so we won't know how it goes under power, but for now, that is very good. Pretty much how it used to drive before, which is a really good sign. From a stop here, we're going to be heading up a little bit of a hill, so let's see how she goes. A little bit of a stumble at low revs, but otherwise, very good. Shifting perfectly. Let's drop it back to third, back to second. Yeah, all as expected. Really, the whole purpose of what I'm doing here is to try and set up a base map, which I can then provide to you as a download. So you can, install an Elite 750 in your car, download the tune and, load the tune up, and then have a car which will start and drive. We still have to replace fuel injectors. We have a few other modifications to do. So this is really, hopefully, a tune to get you started. Glancing at the fuel trim, it looks like something's been going on there, but I won't know till we pull over and have a look. We'll head out to the Boral Proving Grounds. So I'll skip ahead and I'll see you out there. Alright guys, we are at Boral. I have to say this has been a resounding success. The car at the moment, when you're cruising, just feels like it did before. But I have to sort of pinch myself and remind myself that it's actually running on the Haltech. So we'll pull over here, have a look at the laptop. So looking at the long-term fuel trims, it's actually put a ton of fuel into here. I'm guessing that's where it was when I was cruising down here. It's added like 28, 14. It's sort of throwing in a bit of fuel here. So what you could do is bump up the base fuel table potentially by something like 5%. And see if that helps anything. That should, yeah, see it's actually reducing some of those. So it is a bit alarming when you see such a high number in this cell and then very low numbers around it, because when you go from 2 grand to 2.5 grand in the revs, it's kind of transitioning from 28 to almost nothing. It's added a lot of fuel at 2 grand, but then adding none at 2.5, if that makes sense. But so long as the car runs smoothly, and it'll keep adding or removing fuel as it needs it. Let's pull away. Pulls away super smooth. So when it's hot, up at operating temp, beautiful. When it was cold, it was a little bit angry at low revs. So yeah, we might have to look at the enrichment table when the coolant temp is low. Potentially not getting enough fuel. So next up for this car, we're going to be putting some larger fuel injectors in it. We're going to be upgrading the fuel pump in the near future as well. The injector data, I think, is not 100% accurate here. So when I slap those new injectors in, they're much bigger injectors, and you actually load in the proper specs for those injectors. This map is potentially going to be a little bit wrong. It may need a little bit of tweaking. Hopefully it's not too far wrong, and it'll still be able to run. But yeah, it just means that I'm not going to sort of go all out and try and get this map dialed in 100%, because yeah, it is all going to need to change. But at the very least, the car runs, it's happy, smooth, the gearbox shifts properly exactly as it did before. So the gearbox logic, unaffected, which is amazing news. That was one of the things I was really worried about. Apart from the hesitation it gets sometimes at low revs, it just feels like it's running on the AU's normal ECU, which is cool. We'll go down the end here and I'll turn around and I'll try and give it a bit more throttle. If it does lack fuel on those sort of higher throttle zones of the table, it should be adding more fuel instantly. We'll ease into it. This is probably 40%, 50% throttle. It's happy. Very happy. Woo! Awesome. Okay. So this pretty much marks the end of this video. The Haltech and everything that I've installed in it is working flawlessly. I'm pretty proud of myself that I've not encountered any more problems. I was worried I'd take this car out and I wouldn't get it home. I'd have to trailer it home for some reason. If anything happened, I probably would have been able to fix it with my knowledge. But that is awesome. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed this. It is a little bit nerdy when you're talking about some of the tuning aspects of the Haltech, but I love that stuff. So yeah, it's been pretty rewarding to be able to slap that Haltech in load a tune up with my own knowledge and also knowledge from Haltech's website. Between them and me, I've been able to do this. And look at this. We're cruising here at 70 k's an hour down the road, perfectly smooth, the engine's happy. The map should be good enough that I can now give it to you and you can use it too. So if you're interested in that, do click the link in the video description below. I'm going to set up a page on my website dedicated to this. It'll have the link to the wiring diagram. It'll have a link to Haltech's website where they have all the information, but I'll also have a link to the map file, the Haltech 750 map file, which you can download, load into your ECU, and no matter what AU Intech engine you have, it should be good enough that it would run it. I think they all had the same fuel injectors. They had different levels of compression, maybe slightly, but the differences shouldn't be large enough that it would be a problem. You should be able to use that map on any AU engine with an Elite 750, it should run. Don't hold me there. If you know of a reason why that wouldn't happen, do put it in the comment section below, but I think it'll be okay. So, thank you very much for watching. We're going to head back and progress a bit more with this project. Thanks for watching, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.